Colorado Territory, March 1878. Winter still gripped the high country with the determination of something that had conquered this land and was reluctant to surrender it. The wagon climbed the narrow mountain path wheels, finding purchase on stone, still slick with morning frost. Inside, wrapped in a wool coat that had been mended more times than she cared to count, Grace Mitchell clutched her father's leather satchel and watched the landscape grow wilder with each mile. She was 21 years old, though her eyes held the kind of age that comes from loss rather than years. Her father, Edward Mitchell, had been a school teacher in Philadelphia, a good man who taught her to read before she could walk, to question everything, to believe that education was the only wealth that couldn't be stolen. He died 6 months ago, leaving behind more debts than memories, though his love for learning lived on in his daughter's fierce determination to honor his memory through her own work. The Panic of 1873 had broken many families. Theirs was just one more casualty in an economic collapse that had turned the prosperous into the desperate. Grace's mother lay in a charity hospital in Philadelphia, consumption eating away at her lungs. Treatment costing $15 a month they didn't have. The teaching position at Hartley Ridge paid $25 monthly, room and board included. Grace sent $20 home. She lived on the remaining $5 and the stubborn pride her father had called her inheritance. The wagon driver was a weathered man named Owen Fletcher, 52 years old, with a cavalry scout's eyes that never stopped scanning the horizon and a limp from a Confederate bullet that had found him at Kennesaw Mountain in '64. He'd survived the war only to find that survival wasn't the same as living. For 8 years now, he'd worked for Benjamin Hartley, and in those 8 years he'd learned that some silences were companionable and others were prisons. "You look like you're steeling yourself for battle, Miss Mitchell," Owen said, his voice rough as creek gravel but not unkind. Grace straightened her shoulders. "Should I be?" "Depends on what you're expecting. Mr. Hartley isn't what you might call talkative, but he's the finest man I ever worked for. When Mrs. Catherine passed, something broke in him that hasn't mended, but the land still needs tending, the cattle still need feeding, and children still need raising, whether their father remembers how to smile or not." Grace studied the landscape. They'd climbed above the tree line now into country where only the hardiest pines survived, twisted into strange shapes by wind that never stopped blowing. "Tell me about the children." Owen's expression softened, which told Grace more than words could. "Clara's 9. Smart as a whip, reads everything she can get her hands on. But she's been quiet since her mother died. Henry's 6, all elbows and questions, or he used to be. Now he just watches like he's waiting for permission to be a child again. And the land. 640 acres under the Homestead Act. Mr. Hartley claimed the original 160 in 1870, proved it up, then filed for additional acreage under the Desert Land Act. 200 head of cattle, 40 horses. Main cabin, 3 outbuildings, a barn that could withstand Judgment Day, and a garden that nobody's touched in 3 years. The wagon crested the final rise, and Hartley Ridge spread before them. Grace's breath caught, not from the altitude this time, but from the stark beauty of it. The cabin stood solid as the mountain itself, built from lodgepole pine, weathered silver-gray by seasons of sun and storm. Split rail fencing marked boundaries that had been measured not in feet, but in the sweat required to build them. In the distance, cattle grazed in meadows, where spring grass was just beginning to show green beneath winter's brown. But what drew Grace's eye was the garden, or what had been a garden once. Now it was a tangle of dead stalks and broken stems, a square of brown earth surrounded by weathered fencing, standing like a grave marker for something beautiful that had died. "Mrs. Catherine's garden," Owen said quietly. "She loved those flowers more than anything, except maybe her children. When she passed, the flowers died too. Mr. Hartley won't touch it, won't let anyone else touch it either. Just lets it stand there like a monument to loss." Grace looked at that dead ground and something stirred in her chest. Not pity, not even sadness. Just a quiet conviction that sometimes the things we call dead are only sleeping, waiting for someone stubborn enough to wake them. The wagon rolled to a stop before the main cabin. From inside came the sound of a hammer striking wood, each blow precise and measured. Not the frantic pounding of frustration, but the steady rhythm of a man who knew his tools and trusted his hands. Owen climbed down, then offered Grace his hand. "He'll be fixing something. He's always fixing something. I think it's the only way he knows how to feel useful anymore." They found Benjamin Hartley on his knees beside the cabin door, replacing a broken hinge. He was 37 years old, though he carried those years like a man who'd lived twice that long. Not tall by frontier standards, maybe 5'11", but built with the kind of compact strength that came from daily work with stubborn animals and more stubborn land. His hands moved with practiced efficiency, each motion economical, nothing wasted. The mark of a man who understood that in Colorado, winter waste could kill you. He didn't look up when they approached, just kept working, securing the new hinge with screws that bit deep into pine, seasoned by altitude and time. "Mr. Hartley," Owen said. "Miss Mitchell's arrived." Benjamin's hands stilled. He set down his screwdriver with the same care he'd used it, then rose to his feet in one smooth motion. When he finally looked at Grace, his eyes were gray as winter clouds and just as cold. "Miss Mitchell." Not a greeting, just an acknowledgement of her existence. "Mr. Hartley." Grace kept her voice steady. She'd learned young that men like this one respected strength more than sweetness. "I've come as we discussed. Owen told you about the children." "He did. I need them taught reading, writing, arithmetic, basic geography, nothing fancy. They need to know enough to make their way in the world should they choose to leave this mountain someday. And I need them kept safe, in bed by 7, no wandering after dark. The mountain doesn't forgive carelessness." Grace nodded. "I understand. Meals are at 6 in the morning, noon, and 6 in the evening. Not before, not after. Cold food's hard on digestion, and we don't waste fuel reheating what should have been eaten on time." "Yes, sir." Benjamin studied her for a long moment, his gaze weighing something she couldn't name. Then he picked up his screwdriver and returned to his work conversation, ended as abruptly as it had begun. Owen touched Grace's elbow, guiding her toward the smaller cabin that would serve as schoolroom and her quarters. As they walked, he leaned close and spoke quietly. "Don't mind his manner. He talks to everyone like that now. But pay attention to what he does, not what he says. Words don't come easy to him anymore. But his actions, they speak whole volumes if you know how to read them." That evening, as Grace unpacked her few belongings in the small room that would be hers, she heard voices outside. She moved to the window and saw Benjamin in the yard with Henry teaching the boy how to throw a lasso. The child's first 20 attempts failed, the loop falling short or wide or collapsing before it reached the post they'd set as target. But Benjamin never showed impatience. He simply picked up the rope each time corrected. Henry's grip adjusted the angle of his throw, then stepped back and waited for the boy to try again. On the 21st attempt, the loop settled over the post. Benjamin nodded once. Just once. Then his hand came down on Henry's shoulder, and though Grace couldn't hear the words from her window, she saw the pride in that simple gesture. "That's not a cold man," she whispered to herself. "That's a man who's forgotten how to say what he feels, but he still knows how to show it." The first real storm came not from the sky, but on horseback. Marcus Brennan arrived on a Tuesday morning 2 weeks after Grace had settled into the rhythm of Hartley Ridge. He rode with 2 men flanking him, all 3 dressed in the kind of clothes that marked them as city men playing at frontier life. Good boots, too clean. Hats without sweat stains. Coats that had never been mended. Grace was in the schoolroom with Clara and Henry when they heard the horses. Through the window she watched Benjamin emerge from the barn, wiping his hands on a rag. He'd been repairing a wagon axle, the kind of work that required patience and precision. His expression didn't change when he saw the visitors, but something in his posture shifted. A tightening. A readiness. Brennan dismounted with the ease of a man accustomed to horseback, though his saddle was too ornate for real ranch work. 45 years old, handsome in the way that money allows, carrying a leather briefcase that looked out of place against the rough timber of the barn. "Mr. Hartley," Brennan called out, his voice carrying the confidence of someone who'd never been told no. "I have a matter requiring discussion." Benjamin didn't stop wiping his hands. "Then discuss it. It concerns your land claim. I have reason to believe there's been an error in the property records." Benjamin's hands stilled. He set down the rag with deliberate care, then straightened to his full height. "Say what you mean plain." Brennan's smile never wavered. "According to documents at the Denver Land Office, there appear to be 2 patents for this property. Your patent filed in 1870 under the Homestead Act is certainly valid. However, there's a second patent filed in 1869 in the name of Thomas Whitmore. As I'm sure you're aware, prior claim takes precedence under territorial law." The air itself seemed to freeze. Clara's hand found Grace's squeezing tight. "I've been here 8 years, Benjamin said, his voice carrying the kind of quiet that precedes thunder. "Built everything you see from raw land, dug the well, raised the buildings, fenced every acre. Under homestead law, this land is mine." "Absolutely correct," Brennan agreed, pulling papers from his briefcase. "Provided there's no prior claim. But if Mr. Whitmore's patent predates yours, then legally you've been improving another man's property, his estate's property to be precise, an estate I've recently acquired rights to." Benjamin took the papers, examining them with the care of a man who understood that words on paper could be more dangerous than any weapon. Grace watched from the window as his jaw tightened, the only sign of the fury that must be building behind those gray eyes. "Thomas Whitmore," Benjamin said finally. "Never heard of him. Never saw evidence of anyone living here when I claimed this land in 1870, and homestead law requires 5 years of occupation and improvement. If your Whitmore existed, where's proof he ever set foot on this property?" "Excellent question," Brennan said, his smile growing sharper. "Unfortunately, Mr. Whitmore is deceased. Records from his time here may have been lost. But the patent itself is clear, filed, registered, and legally binding. I'd prefer to settle this amicably, Mr. Hartley. I'm prepared to offer $3,000 for the property, enough for you to start fresh elsewhere." "I'm not selling." "Then we'll meet in court. I'm sure you understand nothing personal, just business." Brennan remounted his horse with theatrical flourish. "You have a beautiful property here, Mr. Hartley. It would be a shame to lose it over a matter of paperwork. Think about my offer." The 3 riders departed, leaving Benjamin standing alone in the yard, papers in hand, looking at the land he'd spent 8 years taming, looking at the cabin where his wife had died, the barn he'd built timber by timber, the fences he'd set post by post, looking at everything he stood to lose. That evening, after the children were in bed, Grace found Owen in the barn mending tack by lamplight. The old scout's hands moved with the same practiced economy as Benjamin's, each stitch placed exactly where it needed to be. "I saw what happened this afternoon," Grace said quietly. Owen's hands didn't stop working. "Then you saw a man get kicked in the teeth by the law he thought would protect him. Can Mr. Brennan really take this land? If his paperwork's legitimate and predates Mr. Hartley's claim, territorial law's clear. First patent wins. Doesn't matter who actually lived here, who improved it, who bled for it. Only matters who filed first." Owen's voice carried the bitterness of a man who'd seen too many good things destroyed by legal technicalities. "Men like Brennan, they're buying up land all over Colorado. They know most homesteaders don't keep careful records. They find gaps in the paperwork, manufacture prior claims, then force sales or file suit. By the time the courts sorted out, the homesteaders broke from legal fees. But surely Mr. Hartley can fight this." "Oh, he'll fight. That's not a man who surrenders easy, but fighting costs money. Lawyer in Denver wants $200 up front plus $50 a month until it's resolved. Court fees add another $75. Travel costs, time away from the ranch, it all adds up. Mr. Hartley's got maybe $1,200 in savings. This fight could eat most of it, and if he loses anyway—" Owen finally looked up from his work, and in his weathered face, Grace saw something that made her throat tight. Not fear, but the weary recognition of how often the world punished men for being honorable. If he loses everything. 8 years of work, the home where his children were born, the grave where his wife's buried, everything that makes him who he is. And men like Brennan, they sleep fine at night because the law says they're in the right, even when everyone with eyes can see they're wrong. Grace stood in silence processing this. She'd known poverty, she'd known loss, but she'd never known the particular cruelty of having something you'd built with your own hands stolen because of words on paper you couldn't prove were lies. "There has to be something we can do," she said finally. Owen smiled, though there was no humor in it. "We do what we've always done, Miss Mitchell. We work, we wait. We hope that truth weighs more than paperwork when the judge makes his decision. And we remember that some things are worth fighting for, even when the odds say we'll lose." The next morning, Grace began her teaching duties in earnest. She'd converted the eastern cabin into a schoolroom, arranging the sparse furniture to create space for learning. Clara sat at the small desk with the rigid posture of someone who'd been taught that stillness was a virtue. Henry fidgeted 6 years old and full of energy he was too polite to release. Grace didn't start with books. She started with questions. "Clara, what can you see from the window?" The girl blinked, surprised. "The mountains, Miss Mitchell." "And what do you know about mountains?" "They're made of stone." "What kind of stone? How did it get there? How long has it been there?" Grace moved to the window, gesturing at the landscape. "Everything you see has a story. The mountains were born from fire and pressure lifted up when the earth itself was young. The trees grow where they do because of water and sun and soil. Even the grass knows mathematics. Each blade growing at angles that capture the most light following equations nobody taught them, but they solve anyway every single day." Henry's eyes widened. "Grass knows math." "Everything in nature knows math, Henry. Birds know geometry when they fly in formation. Bees know architecture when they build their hives. Your father knows engineering every time he builds a fence that stands against winter wind. Math isn't something we invented. It's something we discovered. The world was always mathematical. We just learned to see it." Clara leaned forward, interested despite herself. "What else does the world know?" Grace smiled. "Everything. And our job is to learn how to read what it's trying to teach us." She spent the morning weaving lessons into observation. They counted cattle to learn arithmetic, drew maps of the property to learn geography, read passages from Grace's worn copy of Shakespeare to learn language, then rewrote the scenes as if they took place on a Colorado ranch, learning that stories could be transformed without losing their truth. By noon, both children were engaged in ways Grace suspected they hadn't been since their mother died. Clara's rigid posture had relaxed. Henry's fidgeting had transformed into eager movement between projects. They were still grieving children, but they were remembering how to be curious again. After lunch, Grace suggested they take their learning outside. "I want to show you something." She led them west, following a path that wound through stands of pine and aspen. The trees here grew in strange patterns bent by wind and snow into shapes that seemed almost deliberate. Henry ran ahead while Clara walked beside Grace with the careful steps of someone afraid to appear too eager. The path opened onto a clearing where a small cabin stood older than the main house, built closer to the creek that ran year-round even when drought baked the lower meadows. The door hung crooked. Windows were dark as empty eye sockets, but the structure itself was sound, the logs still tight despite years of neglect. "What is this place?" Grace asked. Clara's voice went quiet. "Mama's cabin. She came here when she wanted to be alone. Said it was the one place on Hartley Ridge that was just hers." They circled the cabin to the south side, and Grace's breath caught. There, in a plot maybe 20 feet square, was what had once been a garden. Dead stalks stood like monuments to lost hope. Dried stems rattled in the wind, like bones. The earth itself looked gray, lifeless, cursed by absence. But Grace knelt down, pushing aside the brittle remains, and pressed her palm to the soil beneath. It was cold, yes, hard, yes, but not dead. Beneath the surface she could feel moisture from snowmelt nutrients from years of decay. Life waiting. "Your mother planted these flowers?" Grace asked. Henry nodded. "Forget-me-nots, blue ones, and others, purple and yellow. She said they reminded her of home. They died when Mama died." Clara added, her voice carrying the conviction of someone stating an unchangeable fact. Grace looked at the dead garden, then at the two children watching her with eyes that had already learned too much about loss. She thought about her father teaching her that education wasn't about memorizing facts, but about learning to see possibility where others saw only limits. "Not everything here is dead," Grace said quietly. "Look closer." She pulled aside more of the dried stems, revealing tiny green shoots pushing up through the hard soil. Life so small it was almost invisible, but undeniably there, surviving despite 3 years of neglect, waiting for someone to notice, to care, to help. "Some things don't die," Grace continued. "They just sleep, waiting for the right moment, the right person, the right touch of care to wake them up again." Clara knelt beside her, fingers trembling as she touched one of the tiny shoots. "Could we wake them up? Miss Mitchell? Could we make Mama's garden bloom again?" Grace looked at the two children, at the impossible task, at the dead ground that everyone said was cursed. She thought about Marcus Brennan and his legal papers, about Benjamin Hartley and the land he stood to lose, about all the ways the world could take beautiful things and let them die. Then she thought about seeds, about how the smallest, most unlikely things could grow into something that changed everything. "Yes," Grace said, "I think we could, but it won't be easy. The soil needs turning. The dead growth needs clearing. We'll need new seeds, fresh water, daily tending. Gardens don't bloom on wishes. They bloom on work." "We can work," Henry said immediately. "Papa says work is how you earn things worth having." Clara's hand found Grace's. "Will you help us?" Grace squeezed the small hand in hers, feeling the calluses that were already forming from ranch life, feeling the trust being offered. "Every day," she promised, "until we see what this garden can become." They returned to the cabin, Grace's mind already planning. But when she circled around to enter through the crooked door, she noticed something. The floor inside was wooden planks worn smooth by years of use, and in one corner the planks didn't quite fit right, as if they'd been lifted and replaced, but not perfectly. Curiosity pulled her forward. Clara and Henry waited outside as Grace knelt, running her fingers along the seam. There, a tiny gap. She worked her fingernails into it, prying gently, and the board lifted free. Beneath, in a space that had been hollowed from the earth itself, lay a leather-bound journal. Grace's hands shook as she lifted it out. The cover was embossed with initials C.R.H. Catherine Rose Hartley. The leather was soft with age and handling, suggesting this book had been opened many times, filled with words that mattered. Grace knew she shouldn't read it. This was private, personal, the intimate thoughts of a woman who died believing they would stay hidden forever. But her hands opened the cover anyway. The first entry was dated March 15, 1873. "I planted forget-me-nots today where Daniel and I used to meet. Benjamin thinks this garden is for him. But every bloom will be a secret memory of the man I loved first, the man I could never have. Is it wicked to build beauty on the grave of the impossible? I don't know. But I need this. I need something in this life that's mine alone, even if it's just a garden full of secrets." Grace's breath stopped. She turned to the next entry. June 2, 1873. "Benjamin proposed today. He knelt in this very garden, in the place he thinks is special to me because I spend so much time here. If he knew this was where Daniel kissed me goodbye, where we made promises we couldn't keep, would he still have chosen this spot? I said yes to Benjamin's proposal. Not because I love him the way a woman should love her husband, but because I'm tired. Tired of waiting for a man who chose duty over love. Tired of being alone. Benjamin is good, kind, steady. Everything Daniel isn't. Maybe that's enough. Maybe love isn't necessary. Maybe respect and companionship can build a marriage that lasts. I hope so, because I can't keep living in the ghost of what might have been. I need to move forward even if my heart stays behind." The words hit Grace like physical blows. Catherine Hartley, the woman whose memory haunted this ranch, whose death had broken Benjamin, hadn't loved him, had married him out of exhaustion, not affection, had built a life with him while her heart belonged to someone else entirely. Grace's mind raced. Did Benjamin know? Had he understood that his wife's heart was elsewhere, or had he lived 8 years believing he'd been loved when he'd only been accepted? She should close the journal, should put it back in its hiding place and never speak of what she'd found. This was knowledge that could destroy a man who'd already lost so much. But something made her mark the page and keep the journal close. Not to hurt Benjamin with it, but because understanding Catherine's truth might be the only way to prevent Grace from making the same mistake. The mistake of building something on false foundations, of letting loneliness or convenience or anything other than honest truth determine the shape of her life. She tucked the journal into her coat and returned to the children, her mind heavy with secrets. That evening, Grace learned another kind of teaching happened at Hartley Ridge. She heard the wagon before she saw it, the distinctive squeak of a wheel that needed greasing. Looking out, she watched Benjamin load tools into the bed hammer nails coils of wire spare fence posts. Henry appeared from the barn, excitement bright on his young face. "Can I come, Papa? Can I help?" Benjamin considered for a long moment, then nodded once. "That's why I'm taking you." Grace watched them ride out together, father and son, heading north toward the section of fence that winter storms had damaged. She wanted to follow to observe, but something told her this was a private moment, a kind of teaching that required no audience. They returned 3 hours later, both dirty and tired. But Henry was smiling in a way Grace hadn't seen before, real, unforced, the smile of a child who'd been given something more valuable than toys or treats. That night after dinner, Henry showed Grace his hands. They were rough with fresh blisters forming on the palms. "Papa taught me how to hammer posts," Henry said proudly. "He said I need to hit 3 times, not more, not less. If I need 4 hits, it means I'm hitting at the wrong angle. He showed me how to sight down the post to make sure it's straight, and how to check if the wire's tight enough without being too tight, too loose and cat'll push through, too tight and it snaps in winter freeze." Grace smiled. "Your father's a good teacher." He said something else, too. Henry's voice dropped to the serious tone children use when repeating words they sense are important. He said that someday I can be whatever I want, doctor, lawyer, anything. But no matter what I do, I need to know how to work with my hands, how to fix what's broken, how to build things that last longer than I do. He said that's what his papa taught him and what he's teaching me. He called it legacy. Later, when the children were asleep and Grace sat by lamplight in her small room, she thought about that word, legacy. Benjamin wasn't just teaching Henry practical skills. He was passing down a way of being in the world, a code of craftsmanship, of honor, of taking responsibility for your corner of creation and leaving it better than you found it. That was the kind of man Benjamin Hartley was, not eloquent, not demonstrative, but solid as mountain stone and just as permanent. Grace opened her notebook, the one her father had given her, with the instruction to fill it with observations about life, and began to write. There is in this place a different kind of silence. Not the heavy silence of Philadelphia boarding houses where poverty makes people quiet because speaking requires energy they don't have. This is the silence of mountains that have watched over human joys and sorrows for eons, a silence that feels almost companionable, like someone sitting beside you who doesn't need words to communicate understanding. She paused, pen hovering above paper, then continued. Mr. Hartley is a man difficult to describe with simple words, so correct in all his dealings, so distant in his manner, maintaining always the proper space between employer and employee. And yet when he stops to speak about small matters, about weather, or the children's progress, or the way the wildflowers are trying to return to life in his late wife's garden, it seems as though something within him is asking for help. He cannot bring himself to request directly. Her hand trembled slightly as she wrote the next lines. I find myself watching for him in the mornings when I cross to the children's quarters, listening for the sound of his voice in the corridors, noticing the way light falls across his shoulders when he stands in the clearing at sunset, looking toward the mountains as if searching for something he lost among those peaks. I don't know if what I feel when he looks at me is respect for his position, gratitude for his kindness to a stranger, or something I dare not name even to myself in the privacy of my own thoughts. Grace stopped writing abruptly, her breath catching. She read over what she'd written, seeing the truth of it laid bare on paper. These weren't the observations of an employee about an employer. These were the tentative, terrified admissions of a woman beginning to feel something she had no right to feel. She closed the notebook quickly, as if the words might escape and be read by eyes not meant to see them. Tomorrow she would address the letter properly to Beth Morrison, her childhood friend in Philadelphia, and send it on the monthly mail wagon. Or perhaps she'd wait. Give herself time to reconsider such honesty. For tonight she simply tucked the notebook beside Catherine's journal and tried not to think about how dangerous it was to carry two sets of secrets, neither of them truly hers to keep. Sleep came slowly that night. Outside her window, the mountains stood like sentinels under starlight, ancient and patient, having seen countless human dramas play out in their shadow. Tomorrow, she would begin the real work of reviving the garden. Tomorrow, she would teach Clara and Henry more about seeing the world clearly. Tomorrow, she would keep her distance from Benjamin Hartley and remember her place. Tomorrow, always tomorrow. But tonight in the darkness, Grace Mitchell let herself wonder what it might be like to belong somewhere permanent, to plant roots instead of seeds, to be more than a temporary presence in someone else's life, to be chosen not out of desperation or convenience, but out of genuine desire, the way Catherine had chosen Daniel, the way she'd never quite chosen Benjamin. Grace's last thought before sleep claimed her was a prayer she barely dared form into words. Please don't let me make her mistakes, and please don't let him pay for them again. The shadows of the cabin deepened, lamplight fading to darkness. In the main house, Benjamin Hartley sat in his study, legal documents spread before him, weighing the cost of fighting for what was his against the cost of losing everything trying. In the barn, Owen Fletcher cleaned and oiled his old cavalry pistol, remembering other battles, other times when right and wrong had been decided by force instead of law. And high in the mountains, in a cabin that had been forgotten by everyone except the woman who'd loved it and the man who'd loved her Catherine's secrets, waited in the darkness like seeds in frozen ground, waiting for spring, waiting for truth, waiting for someone brave enough to dig deep and face what lay buried. The story had begun. The seeds were planted. Now came the hardest part, the waiting, the work, the slow transformation that turns winter into spring and strangers into something more. The mountains knew. They'd seen it all before. They would see it all again. They simply stood and waited, patient as stone, knowing that human stories might change, but human hearts remained eternal. Always hoping, always fearing, always reaching toward light even when buried in darkness, always growing even when they thought they were only surviving. The first day had ended. The foundation was laid. And on Hartley Ridge, beneath the watching mountains, beneath the stars that had seen the birth of continents and would see their end, 3 people slept, each carrying secrets, each hoping for spring, each planting seeds without knowing if they would survive the winter still to come. April arrived at Hartley Ridge with the kind of false promise that mountain country specializes in. Days when the sun felt warm enough to believe winter had finally surrendered, followed by nights when frost still claimed the ground and reminded everyone that spring was earned, not given. The wildflower seeds Grace had planted lay dormant beneath soil that looked dead but wasn't. Waiting, testing, deciding whether to risk the vulnerability of growth or stay safely buried. Grace understood the feeling. 2 weeks after Marcus Brennan's visit, Benjamin rode down to Denver. 40 miles of mountain trail that would take 2 days each direction, leaving the ranch in Owen's capable hands and the children in Grace's care. He left before dawn, his saddlebags packed with documents, his face set with the grim determination of a man going to war. Grace watched from her window as he mounted his horse, movements economical even in the pre-dawn darkness. Owen stood beside him, speaking quietly, their voices too low to carry, but their postures communicating everything words might have failed to express. 2 men who'd fought different battles in different wars, united now by loyalty and the stubborn conviction that some things were worth defending even when the odds said otherwise. Then Benjamin was gone, swallowed by mountain shadows, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier than his presence ever had. The children felt it too. Clara moved through her lessons with distracted precision, answering questions correctly but without engagement. Henry kept running to the window as if expecting his father to reappear, as if 2 days might pass in 2 minutes if he watched hard enough. On the second evening, with Benjamin still gone, Owen came to the schoolroom. He carried a wooden box, its surface worn smooth by decades of handling. "Thought the children might want to see something," he said, setting the box on the desk. Inside were photographs, letters, documents, yellow with age. The accumulated evidence of Benjamin Hartley's 8 years on this land. Owen spread them out with careful hands. "This was the ridge when your father first claimed it. See nothing but raw land. That pile of logs there that became the main cabin. Took him 4 months to build it, working every daylight hour. He cut every tree himself, hauled every stone for the foundation, made the furniture inside from what was left over." Clara leaned forward, studying a photograph of a younger Benjamin face, barely visible beneath trail dust, standing beside the skeleton frame of what would become their home. "Why are you showing us this?" she asked. Owen's weathered face softened. "Because sometimes when we're afraid of losing something, it helps to remember how it was built. Your father didn't inherit this land. He earned it. Every fence post, every building, every acre. Whatever that judge in Denver decides, nobody can take away the fact that Benjamin Hartley took raw wilderness and made it a home. That's in the land itself now, in the bones of every structure. And that's in you, too. His children, his legacy." Henry picked up another photograph. Benjamin and Catherine on their wedding day, young and hopeful, neither of them knowing what the future would actually hold. "Do you think Papa will win?" "I think your father's never quit anything in his life," Owen said carefully. "And I don't expect he'll start now. But winning and losing, sometimes they're more complicated than we want them to be. Sometimes you can lose everything and still keep what matters, or win everything and lose what you needed most." Grace heard the weight behind those words, the voice of experience speaking truths learned through hard living. On the third day, Benjamin returned. Grace heard the horse before she saw it, hooves on stone, exhaustion in the rhythm. She stepped onto the porch as Benjamin dismounted, and even from a distance she could see the weight he carried. Not just in his posture, though his shoulders were tighter than before, but in his eyes. The look of a man who'd stared at numbers on paper and understood exactly what they meant. That evening, after the children were fed and settled, Grace found herself walking past the barn, not quite by accident, where lamplight spilled from the open door, and voices drifted into the cooling air. "200 up front," Benjamin was saying, voice flat with exhaustion. "50 a month until it's resolved. Court fees another 75. Travel costs. Time away when I should be working. Reed thinks it could take 6 months, maybe longer. I've got 1,200 saved. This fight will eat half of it, maybe more, and if I lose anyway—" "You won't lose." Owen's voice carried absolute conviction. "That Whitmore patent's fake as a $3 bill. Any judge with eyes can see it." "Maybe, but Brennan's got good lawyers, and the law doesn't care about what's fair. It cares about what's documented. He's got paper that looks legitimate. All I've got is my word that nobody named Whitmore was here when I claimed this land." A pause. Then Owen spoke again, quieter now. "I've got 300 saved. You can have it." Grace's breath caught. $300. For a ranch foreman, that was years of careful saving. A lifetime security offered without hesitation. "Owen," Benjamin's voice roughened, "I can't take your money." "You're not taking. I'm investing. When we win, you pay me back with interest. When not, if. That's a bet I'll make any day." Another pause. Longer. Grace could almost feel Benjamin wrestling with pride and necessity, with the hard calculation of a man who understood that refusing help might be the same as surrendering. 5% interest, Benjamin said finally. 10. I'm not running a charity. This is business. Grace heard something that might have been a laugh. Brief. Rusty from disuse. But real. Deal. The sound of hands clasping. 2 men bound by more than employment now. By trust. by the kind of friendship that needs no declaration because it's proven through action instead of words. Grace moved away before they could discover her eavesdropping, her heart tight with emotion she couldn't quite name. She'd known men in Philadelphia who'd call themselves friends while stabbing each other in the back over $1 difference. And here in this hard mountain country, she'd witnessed loyalty that money couldn't buy and words couldn't adequately describe. The kind of loyalty that made a man offer his life savings to protect another man's dream. The kind of loyalty that made accepting that offer not weakness but wisdom. The next morning brought clouds that smelled like rain. Grace woke to the sound of distant thunder and the particular tension in the air that precedes mountain storms. She dressed quickly, planning the day's lessons, thinking they'd need to stay indoors if the weather turned. She never made it to the schoolroom. The storm broke just after midnight. Not the gentle spring rain the garden needed, but a violent deluge fed by rapid snowmelt from higher elevations. Grace woke to the sound of rushing water wrong and too close and understood immediately what was happening. The creek was flooding. She pulled clothes over her nightdress feet, finding boots in the darkness, and ran outside without conscious thought. Lightning illuminated the landscape in stark flashes. The creek that normally ran gentle and contained had become a torrent brown with mud and debris overflowing its banks and spreading across the lower meadow. Spreading toward Catherine's garden. Grace reached the garden just as water began lapping at the southern edge. The tiny shoots she and the children had been tending so carefully would drown if the flood wasn't diverted. She grabbed the shovel they'd left propped against the cabin already soaked to the skin and began digging, creating a channel, trying to redirect the water around the garden instead of through it. But the ground was hard despite the rain, and she was one person against a mountain's worth of runoff. The water kept coming, kept rising, and Grace kept digging with the desperate energy of someone fighting a battle they couldn't win alone but refused to surrender. Then there was another shovel beside hers, another person digging, Benjamin. He didn't speak, didn't ask what she was doing or why she thought it mattered, just dug with the same focused intensity he brought to every task, reading the water's flow, understanding instantly what needed to happen, executing it with practiced efficiency. They worked for 2 hours in the rain and darkness, digging channels, piling stones, creating barriers that redirected the flood's force around the garden's perimeter. Grace's hands blistered, her back screamed, her lungs burned from exertion in thin mountain air, but she didn't stop, didn't slow. Because Benjamin didn't stop, and somehow it became unthinkable that she might quit before he did. By the time the sky lightened toward dawn, the immediate danger had passed. The channels were holding. The garden was muddy, but intact tiny green shoots still bravely reaching toward a sun they couldn't yet see. Grace and Benjamin stood at the garden's edge, both soaked through, both exhausted, watching water flow where they'd directed it instead of where nature had intended. The rain had gentled to steady drizzle. The thunder had moved east, grumbling down the valley like a defeated army retreating. Benjamin looked at Grace for the first time since he'd appeared beside her in the darkness. Really looked. Saw her sodden clothes, her mud-streaked face, her hands raw from gripping the shovel. Saw her standing there at 3 a.m. in a storm, fighting to save flowers that most people thought were already dead. Why? His voice was rough, whether from exhaustion or emotion Grace couldn't tell. She met his eyes, gray as storm clouds, deep enough to drown in if she wasn't careful. Because they deserve to survive, she said simply. Because your wife planted them with hope, and hope shouldn't be allowed to die just because the one who planted it couldn't stay to see it bloom. Something shifted in Benjamin's face, some wall cracking letting light through gaps that had been sealed for years. "Thank you," he said, and the words carried weight beyond gratitude, carried acknowledgement of something neither of them was quite ready to name. They walked back toward the main cabin as dawn broke properly, painting the soaked landscape in shades of silver and gold. Neither spoke. Neither needed to. They'd communicated in the universal language of shared work, shared purpose, shared exhaustion, that meant something had been accomplished worth the cost. At the porch, Benjamin paused. "Miss Mitchell." Grace turned. "Grace?" He corrected himself. her name sounding strange in his mouth like he was testing the shape of it. "What you did tonight, not just the work, but caring enough to do it. That means something." Grace felt her breath catch. "Mr. Hartley?" "Benjamin." The corner of his mouth twitched, almost a smile. "Fair's fair." They stood there in the early morning light, the proper distance between employer and employee suddenly feeling less proper and more like a barrier that circumstances had just seriously damaged. Then Benjamin cleared his throat and stepped back, restoring space and propriety with visible effort. "You should get dry. Rest. The children will need their teacher at full strength." Grace nodded, not trusting her voice, and fled to her cabin before she could say something that would make this moment mean more than either of them was prepared to handle. But as she stripped off wet clothes and toweled her hair dry, she knew with absolute certainty that something had changed. Some line had been crossed in the darkness and the rain, and there would be no uncrossing it no matter how carefully they both pretended otherwise. Clara saw it first. She was 9 years old, but she had her mother's eyes for reading people and her father's talent for patient observation. And she'd been watching Benjamin and Grace carefully ever since the night of the flood, noting things adults thought children were too young to notice. The way Benjamin's eyes followed Grace when he thought nobody was looking. The way his posture changed when she entered a room, straightening slightly, becoming more aware. The way he found excuses to walk past the schoolroom, checking on progress that didn't need checking, asking questions that didn't need asking. And Grace, the way her voice softened when speaking about him to the children. The way she paid attention to his schedule, always seeming to know when he'd be in from working, when he'd take his coffee, when he'd spend evening hours in his study reviewing accounts. Clara discussed this with Henry one afternoon while Grace was in the garden and Benjamin was in the barn. "They like each other," she told her brother with the authority of superior years and feminine intuition. Henry looked up from the wooden horse he was carving under Owen's patient instruction. "Papa and Miss Grace." "Obviously." "But Papa doesn't like anyone, not since Mama died." Clara shook her head. "That's what everyone thinks. But I've been watching. He doesn't look at anyone else the way he looks at her. Not Aunt Eleanor when she visits. Not Mrs. Peterson from town. Not anyone. He looks at Miss Grace like she's water, and he's been thirsty for a very long time." Henry considered this with 6-year-old seriousness. "Does that mean we'll have a new mama?" "Maybe, if the grown-ups don't ruin it by being scared." "Should we help?" Clara's expression turned calculating. "No. Grown-ups get strange when children interfere in their business. We just watch, and wait, and be ready to make sure Miss Grace doesn't leave if things get hard." Henry nodded solemnly, and they returned to their respective tasks. Conspirators united by the secret knowledge that love was trying to bloom at Hartley Ridge, fragile as new flowers, just as likely to be killed by frost as to survive into summer. They weren't wrong about the danger. Eleanor Hartley arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in late April unannounced as always, traveling in a hired carriage that looked absurdly elegant against the rough mountain landscape. She was 38 years old, Catherine's older sister, tall and handsome in the way that money allows. Her clothes were Denver fashionable. Her posture was finishing school perfect. And her eyes, when they landed on Grace, teaching the children in the yard, went cold as January ice. Benjamin was in the north pasture checking cattle when Eleanor arrived. Owen greeted her with cautious courtesy, years of service having taught him to be polite to family even when he didn't trust them. Grace stood from where she'd been helping Henry identify different types of pine cones, feeling immediately underdressed in her simple work dress, immediately conscious of the dirt on her hands and the casual way her hair had escaped its pins. "You must be the new teacher," Eleanor said, her voice carrying the kind of false warmth that barely concealed inspection. "I'm Eleanor Hartley. Catherine was my sister. Grace Mitchell." Grace offered her hand, which Eleanor took briefly before releasing as if physical contact with hired help was something to be endured rather than embraced. "How long have you been at Hartley Ridge?" 6 weeks, Mrs. Hartley." "And you're finding the position suitable?" "Very much so. The children are bright and eager to learn." Eleanor's gaze shifted to Clara and Henry, and for just a moment genuine affection softened her features. "They're good children. They deserve the best care possible. The implication was clear. The question was whether Grace qualified as best or merely available. That evening, with Eleanor settled into the guest room and the children in bed, Grace heard voices from the main house. She told herself she wasn't eavesdropping. She was simply taking an evening walk that happened to pass near an open window where Eleanor and Benjamin were talking. "She's very young," Eleanor was saying. "The teacher. She's 21, old enough to know her work. I'm sure she's competent. I'm just wondering if it's entirely appropriate. A young unmarried woman living on the property of a widower. People talk, Benjamin." "Let them talk." Benjamin's voice carried an edge Grace hadn't heard before. "Grace is an employee, a good one. What people choose to imagine is their concern, not mine. Of course, I'm only thinking of your reputation and the children's. They've been through so much already. They don't need more upset. They're doing better now than they have in 3 years. That's because of Grace." A pause. Grace could almost hear Eleanor recalculating, adjusting her approach. "She's reviving Catherine's garden." Flat statement, almost accusatory. "With the children's help. Clara asked if they could try. I said yes." "And you don't think that's inappropriate, Catherine's garden? Her place? I think the dead don't own places. They leave them behind for the living to decide what to do with. Catherine loved that garden. She'd want it to bloom again, not stand as a monument to loss." Another pause, longer. "You sound different, Benjamin, lighter somehow." "Maybe I'm tired of being heavy." Grace heard the scrape of chair legs, someone standing. Benjamin's voice again, firmer now. "Eleanor, I appreciate your concern, but I don't need protection from my own employee. Grace is here to teach the children. She's doing that job well. That's all there is to it." "Of course," Eleanor said too smoothly. "I'm sure you're right." But Grace heard the undertone, the quiet promise that this conversation wasn't finished, just postponed, and when she finally risked a glance through the window, she saw Eleanor's face in lamplight, beautiful and bitter, watching Benjamin with eyes that held too much history and too many unspoken words. Grace retreated to her cabin, unease settling in her stomach like stones. She'd grown up poor enough to recognize when someone with power had decided you were a problem. And Eleanor Hartley, whatever her reasons, had just classified Grace Mitchell as something that needed to be dealt with. The question was, how and when? The garden bloomed in early May. Grace woke one morning to find the brown earth transformed into color. Blue forget-me-nots, hundreds of them, tiny faces turned toward the sun. Purple lupines standing tall, yellow columbines dancing in the breeze. The seeds she'd planted with more hope than confidence had decided to trust spring after all. She stood at the garden's edge, tears running unchecked down her face, overwhelmed by the simple miracle of life returning to what everyone had declared dead. Clara and Henry found her there, and soon all three were crying and laughing at the same time, kneeling among the flowers, touching petals with reverent fingers. Benjamin came to see what the commotion was about, and stopped short at the sight. The garden, blooming. After 3 years of death, suddenly alive again with color and scent, and the particular beauty of small things surviving against odds. Owen stood beside him, both men silent, watching Grace and the children move through the flowers like they were walking in a dream. "She did it," Owen said quietly. "I'll be damned. She actually did it." Benjamin didn't respond. Couldn't. His throat was too tight with emotions he didn't know how to process. Grief because Catherine should be here to see this. Relief that the children were laughing again. And something else. Something dangerous and impossible to ignore. Wonder. At the woman who'd looked at dead ground and seen possibility. Who'd worked in darkness and flood to protect tiny shoots most people wouldn't have noticed. Who'd given his children their mother's garden back, not as a grave marker, but as a living promise that beautiful things could return even after the cruelest winters. That evening, Benjamin did something he hadn't done in 3 years. He invited Grace to walk with him after supper. They followed the path that wound along the ridge's eastern edge, where the land dropped away toward the valley below, and the sunset painted everything in shades of amber and gold. Neither spoke at first, comfortable in the silence that had become their primary language, saying more with presence than most people managed with words. Finally, Benjamin stopped at a viewpoint where a flat rock offered space to sit and look out over miles of wilderness. "I need to tell you something," he said, his voice careful. "About Catherine, about my marriage, about the truth that everyone thinks they know but nobody really does." Grace's heart hammered. She thought about the diary hidden in her room, the secrets she'd read, the knowledge she'd carried like stolen goods. "You don't have to," she said quietly. "Yes, I do." Benjamin stared out at the mountains, his profile etched against the dying light. "Because if there's going to be anything between us, anything real, it needs to be built on truth, not on the ghost of a marriage that people remember wrong." He took a breath, and Grace could see the cost of what he was about to say. "I met Catherine in 1872. She was visiting from Denver, beautiful, educated, from a good family. I was a rancher with a homestead claim and not much else. When she agreed to marry me, I thought I'd won some kind of lottery, thought I didn't deserve her, but I'd spend my life trying to be worthy." A pause. Thunder rumbled in the distance. Storm coming. "But after the wedding I started to see things. The way she'd go quiet for days. The way she'd look at me sometimes like she was measuring the distance between who I was and who she'd wanted. The way she'd spend hours in that garden and I wasn't allowed to join her there. It was hers alone, she said, her private place. I respected that. Maybe I shouldn't have." Grace waited, barely breathing. She tried, I'll give her that. She never complained, never said she was unhappy. But I could feel it, the gap between us. Like we were two people standing in the same room but living in different houses. She was my wife, but she was never really mine. And I was her husband, but I was never who she wanted. His voice roughened. When she got pregnant, I thought maybe that would fix things, give us something real to build on. But she lost the baby at 3 months, and the way she cried after it wasn't just grief. It was relief mixed with grief, and that was somehow worse, like she was mourning what she should have wanted but didn't. I never knew what to do with that. Grace's hand moved of its own accord, settling on his arm. Benjamin looked down at it, then at her face, and his eyes held depths of pain she'd only glimpsed before. She died during a fever epidemic that went through the territory in 1875, 3 days from first symptom to gone. I sat beside her bed and held her hand, and at the very end she said something. A name. Daniel. I never knew who Daniel was, but I knew from the way she said it that he was who she'd really loved. I was just who she'd settled for. Silence fell between them, heavy with truth and the weight of years carrying knowledge that couldn't be shared. "I'm not telling you this for sympathy," Benjamin continued. "I'm telling you because I spent 3 years thinking I'd failed her. That if I'd been a better husband, a different man, maybe she would have loved me. Maybe she would have been happy. But I'm starting to understand that some people, they lose their chance at happiness and then spend the rest of their lives trying to find it again in the wrong places. Catherine was looking for someone she couldn't have, and I was the man standing in his shadow." He turned to face Grace fully now, his hand covering hers where it still rested on his arm. "I don't want to live in shadows anymore, Grace. I don't want to build something on false ground. If there's going to be anything between us, and I think we both know there could be, I need you to understand what you'd be getting. A man who's been through one marriage that never quite worked. A man with 2 children and a lawsuit and a mountain of complications. A man who doesn't have pretty words or romantic gestures to offer. Just hard work and honesty and the promise that I'll never ask you to be someone you're not." Grace's throat closed. She thought about Catherine's diary, about Daniel, about secrets and the cost of silence. She should tell Benjamin what she'd found, should confess that she already knew about his wife's divided heart. But looking at his face, seeing the vulnerability it had cost him to speak these truths, she couldn't add to his burden. Not now, maybe not ever. "Benjamin," she said, and his name still felt strange on her tongue, intimate and dangerous. "I don't need pretty words. I grew up with pretty words from men who promised my mother security and then disappeared when times got hard. My father taught me that what matters isn't what people say, but what they do, what they build, how they show up when nobody's watching. She squeezed his arm gently. You show up, every day, for your children, for your land, for the people who depend on you. You don't make empty promises. You don't take the easy path. And you don't pretend to be something you're not. That's worth more than all the poetry in the world. Benjamin's expression shifted, something like hope flickering behind the careful guard he kept on his emotions. I'm not asking for anything, he said carefully, not making any claims. Just wanted you to know the truth before we go any further down this road. What road? Grace asked, her heart hammering. The one where I stop pretending I only notice you because you're good with the children. The one where I admit that I look for you first thing every morning and last thing every night. The one where every time I see you with dirt on your hands from working in that garden, I think about how Catherine never got dirt on her hands if she could help it, and how that difference matters more than I can explain. Thunder again closer now. The storm was racing in from the west clouds, building like mountains of their own. We should get back, Benjamin said, though neither of them moved. Yes, Grace agreed, though her feet seemed rooted to the stone beneath them. They stood in the failing light, the space between them charged with possibilities neither quite dared to reach for. Then Benjamin's hand lifted slow as winter thaw and touched Grace's cheek with fingers rough from work, but gentle as a prayer. Grace, he whispered, and in that single word she heard everything he wasn't saying, everything he wasn't quite ready to promise. She leaned into his touch just slightly, just enough to communicate that she understood, that she felt it too, that whatever was happening between them, she wasn't running from it. The first drops of rain began to fall, and then a voice shattered the moment like glass. Mr. Hartley, Miss Mitchell. Owen running up the path, urgency in every line of his body. You need to come quick. There's a man from Denver. Says it's about the lawsuit. The spell broke. Benjamin's hand dropped. Professional distance slammed back into place between them like a wall. They hurried back to find a young man in a clerk's suit standing on the porch holding papers wrapped in oilcloth to protect them from the rain. He looked nervous, as if he'd rather be anywhere but here delivering news nobody wanted to hear. Mr. Hartley, I'm from Reed & Associates. Mr. Reed asked me to deliver these documents and inform you that the court date has been set, 6 weeks from tomorrow, and there's been a development. Benjamin took the papers, his face unreadable. What development? Mr. Brennan has filed additional documentation. Claims to have letters proving Thomas Whitmore lived on this property in 1869. Says he's found witnesses who'll testify to it. Benjamin's jaw tightened. Witnesses to a lie, more like. Mr. Reed wanted me to tell you he's working on it, but he needs you in Denver next week to review the new evidence and prepare your response. He said to tell you it's going to cost more than he estimated, possibly double. Grace watched Benjamin absorb this blow. $600 instead of $300, plus the money Owen had loaned, plus the court fees, plus the time away from the ranch when calving season was approaching and every day of work mattered. The young clerk handed over the documents, tipped his hat, and fled into the rain, clearly relieved to be done with his unpleasant duty. Benjamin stood on the porch, papers in hand, staring at nothing. Owen and Grace waited, neither knowing what to say. Finally, Benjamin spoke, his voice flat with exhaustion and determination. I need to go to Denver, day after tomorrow. I'll be gone 4 days, maybe 5. I'll handle things here, Owen said immediately. I know you will. Benjamin looked at Grace then, and in his eyes she saw frustration and fear and the particular anger of a good man forced to fight dirty battles against people who had no honor. Grace the children. Keep them safe. Keep them learning. Don't let them see how worried I am. I won't, she promised. He nodded once, then disappeared into the house to read the documents properly, to calculate costs he couldn't afford, but would pay anyway to prepare for another fight in a war he hadn't started, but refused to surrender. Grace stood in the rain, watching lightning illuminate the mountains, feeling the precarious foundation beneath everything good that was trying to grow at Hartley Ridge. The lawsuit could take it all. The land, the home, the future, could scatter them like seeds on stone, forcing new roots in ground that would never feel like home. She thought about Catherine's garden, about flowers that had survived 3 years of death, about how sometimes the most fragile things turned out to be the strongest if only they could survive until spring. But spring was here now, and the real storms were just beginning. Eleanor Hartley watched from the upstairs window, her expression calculating in the lightning flashes. She'd seen Benjamin and Grace on the ridge, seen the way they stood too close, the way their hands touched, the way their bodies leaned toward each other like flowers bending toward sun. Seen enough to know that what she'd feared was happening. Another young woman was taking root in Benjamin's heart, another woman who wasn't Eleanor. She'd allowed it to happen once when Catherine had stolen Benjamin from her without even trying. She wouldn't make that mistake again. Eleanor had come to Hartley Ridge with purposes beyond a simple visit. She'd brought with her an idea barely formed but growing clearer, a way to solve multiple problems at once. Benjamin needed money for legal fees. Colonel James Bradford, recently widowed and looking to invest in Colorado ranching, needed a business partner. And Eleanor needed a reason to bring them together in circumstances that would reveal Grace Mitchell for what she really was. Not a teacher, not an employee, but an opportunist, a social climber, a young woman with designs on a widower's property and position. Eleanor had read the letter Grace had written, but not yet sent, had memorized every word of it during her midnight visit to the teacher's cabin while Grace slept. I find myself watching for him, noticing how light falls across his shoulders, something I dare not name. Those words would serve Eleanor's purpose perfectly. Read aloud in the right circumstances to the right audience, they would destroy Grace's reputation and drive her from Hartley Ridge in shame. Eleanor smiled in the darkness, already composing the invitation that would bring Colonel Bradford to the ranch. Already arranging the pieces on a board Grace didn't even know she was playing on. By the time the storm passed and morning came, Eleanor Hartley had a plan. And Grace Mitchell, sleeping peacefully in her cabin, had no idea that the seeds of her own destruction had just been planted. Part 3. Redemption and Legacy. The evening of the gala arrived wrapped in false elegance. Eleanor had spent 3 days transforming the main house into something that belonged more to Denver society than mountain ranching. Candles in crystal holders borrowed from town, linens pressed until they gleamed, flowers arranged with the precision of someone proving a point. Grace understood immediately what point was being proven. This was Eleanor's territory, her standards, her world. And Grace, in her simple gray dress and black apron, was being positioned exactly where Eleanor wanted her, below, serving, reminded with every moment that she was staff, not family, employee, not equal. Colonel James Bradford arrived first, riding in a carriage too fine for mountain roads, accompanied by 4 couples from Denver's business elite, ranchers who'd made fortunes, merchants who'd capitalized on the territory's growth. People who measured worth in property and propriety, who believed the world had a natural order that shouldn't be disturbed. Grace moved among them like a ghost offering drinks, removing plates, keeping her eyes down, and her expression neutral. She felt Bradford's gaze follow her confusion in it. She'd met him briefly the week before when he'd visited to discuss potential business partnerships with Benjamin. He'd treated her with the respect due to an educated woman. Now, he was seeing her serve, and the cognitive dissonance was clear on his face. Benjamin sat at the head of the table, his discomfort visible to anyone who knew him. He didn't belong in this performance Eleanor had staged, didn't want to play the role of gracious host when his mind was consumed with legal battles and the fear of losing everything. But he endured it because Owen had convinced him that Bradford's investment money might be the only thing standing between keeping the ranch and bankruptcy. The dinner conversation flowed around safe topics: cattle prices, Denver's growth, the railroad's expansion. But Grace felt the undercurrent, the way Eleanor kept steering discussion toward stability, respectability, the importance of maintaining standards in frontier society, building toward something. After dinner, guests gathered in the music room. Eleanor stood at the piano, her fingers trailing across keys she didn't play, and smiled with the particular warmth that preceded violence. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, tapping her glass for attention, "if I might have a moment, there's something I'd like to share, a piece of writing I discovered recently. I think you'll find it quite illuminating." Benjamin's expression shifted to wariness. "Eleanor, this isn't the time." "On the contrary, brother, this is exactly the time." She produced a folded paper from her sleeve with theatrical flourish. "I found this among the library papers, a letter apparently unfinished, but what's written is quite revealing." Grace's blood turned to ice. She knew even before Eleanor began reading what words would come next. Her letter to Beth. The private thoughts she'd never intended for any eyes but her own. Stolen. Weaponized. About to be used to destroy her. Eleanor's voice carried perfectly through the room, sweet as poison honey. "There is in this place a different kind of silence. Mr. Hartley is a man difficult to describe, so proper, so distant. But when he speaks, something within him asks for help he cannot request directly. I find myself watching for him in the mornings, listening for his voice, noticing how light falls across his shoulders at sunset. I don't know if what I feel is respect, gratitude, or something I dare not name even to myself." Murmurs rippled through the gathered guests. Shock. Disapproval. The particularly vicious delight people take in witnessing someone else's humiliation. "I don't know who wrote this," Eleanor continued with false innocence, "but the content seems rather inappropriate given the circumstances. A hired teacher expressing such feelings for her employer. One must wonder about propriety, about intentions, about whether someone seeking a position might have ulterior motives beyond mere employment." Grace stood frozen, every eye in the room turning toward her, judging, condemning. She felt her face burn with shame, not because she'd written those words, but because something private had been made public, something tender had been twisted into something ugly. Colonel Bradford cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Mrs. Hartley, this seems highly irregular." "I quite agree, Colonel, which is why I felt it necessary to bring it to everyone's attention. When we invite people into our homes, into our families, we deserve to know their true character. Don't you think?" Benjamin stood his chair, scraping against wood with violence that made several guests jump. His face was carved from stone eyes blazing with fury Grace had never seen before. "That's enough." Eleanor blinked, surprised by the force of it. "Benjamin, I'm only trying to protect you from potential embarrassment. You're trying to humiliate a woman who has done nothing but serve my family with honor and dedication." Benjamin's voice cut through the room like winter wind. "That letter was stolen from Miss Mitchell's private belongings. Reading it publicly isn't protecting anyone. It's cruelty disguised as concern." "But the content itself," one of the Denver wives ventured. "Surely you must agree it's inappropriate for a teacher to harbor such feelings for her employer." Benjamin turned his attention to the woman, and his gray eyes held steel. "If she harbors such feelings, and I'm not confirming she does, then I consider it a compliment to my character, not a scandal. Miss Mitchell came to Hartley Ridge asking for nothing but fair wages and the chance to teach. She's taught my children more than I'd hoped. She's restored a garden everyone said was dead. She's stood in floods at 3 a.m. to protect flowers that don't belong to her but that she cared about anyway. If that kind of person finds something worth respecting in me, then I'm honored, not offended." The room fell silent, shocked by the passion in his defense. Eleanor's composure cracked slightly. "Benjamin, you're letting emotion cloud your judgment. Think about your reputation, the children's reputation. What will people say? I don't give a damn what people say." The profanity shocked the room more than anything else. Benjamin Hartley didn't curse, didn't lose control, but tonight he was a man who'd reached his limit. "I've spent 3 years caring what people think, living according to expectations, being appropriate, and it's made me miserable. I'm done with it." He turned to address the entire room, now his voice carrying the authority of a man who'd found his ground and wouldn't be moved from it. "Miss Mitchell came to us when we needed her most. She didn't promise miracles. She just worked, quietly, honestly, bringing life back to places we thought were dead. If she's developed feelings in the process, then maybe that speaks to the fact that I'm not the cold man everyone's assumed I've become. Maybe it means I'm capable of being more than a walking monument to grief. He looked at Eleanor then, and his expression mixed pity with anger. You've done what you came here to do, made Grace uncomfortable, made me look foolish, proven that you can still control situations with gossip and innuendo. Are you satisfied? Eleanor's face had gone pale. I was trying to help you avoid making a terrible mistake. The only mistake I'm making is standing here listening to this instead of apologizing to the woman you've just publicly humiliated. Benjamin strode toward the door, but Grace was already moving. She couldn't stay. Couldn't stand another second of these people looking at her like she was something shameful. She ran, ignoring Bradford's protest, ignoring the startled voices behind her running into the night like something hunted. She made it to the garden before the tears came. Catherine's garden, blooming with flowers Grace had coaxed back to life, now witness to her destruction. She knelt among the forget-me-nots, their blue faces turned toward stars they couldn't see, and wept with the particular despair of someone who'd dared to hope and been punished for it. Footsteps behind her, small feet running. Clara appeared, nightgown glowing pale in the darkness, face streaked with her own tears. Miss Grace, don't leave. Please don't leave. Grace caught the child, held her close, trying to compose herself enough to be the adult Clara needed. Oh, sweetheart, I'm so sorry you had to hear that. But you didn't do anything wrong. Clara's voice was fierce despite the tears. Aunt Eleanor's the one who's mean. She read your private letter. That's stealing. I know, honey, but sometimes the truth doesn't matter as much as what people believe. Then people are stupid. Clara pulled back, looking at Grace with eyes too old for 9 years. Papa defended you. Did you hear him? He told everyone you were good and brave, and he was honored if you liked him. That means something. It did mean something. But Grace couldn't process that now. Couldn't think past the immediate need to escape before she fell apart completely in front of a child who'd already witnessed too much adult pain. Clara, listen to me. Grace took the girl's face in her hands. You're strong and smart, and you're going to do amazing things with your life. But I can't stay here anymore. Not after tonight. Do you understand? No. You have to stay. We need you. You have your father, and Owen, and you have each other. You'll be fine. But what about you? Grace had no answer for that. What about her? Where would she go back to Philadelphia and poverty? To another frontier town and another position where she'd always be temporary, always be staff, always be someone who didn't quite belong. She kissed Clara's forehead. I'll be fine too, I promise. But I have to go. She stood, left Clara crying in the garden, and walked back to her cabin, packed her few belongings with shaking hands, wrote a brief letter of resignation, thanking Benjamin for the opportunity, apologizing for any embarrassment her presence had caused. Left it on the table where he'd find it. Then she slipped out the back way, following the trail that wound north toward Pine Creek, walking through darkness, with nothing but stars for guidance, walking away from the only place that had felt like home since her father died, walking away from the man she'd been foolish enough to love. Morning found Benjamin standing in the rain. Not the gentle spring rain that nurtured growing things, but a cold downpour that felt like judgment, washing everything clean or washing everything away, depending on your perspective. He stood in Catherine's garden, in the place Grace had restored, surrounded by flowers that were being battered by the storm, and felt something break inside him that had been cracked since Catherine died but never fully shattered until now. The guests had left shortly after Grace fled. Awkward goodbyes, promises to discuss business later. Colonel Bradford's parting words, "Don't let pride prevent you from seizing happiness when it appears. I made that mistake once. Don't make it twice." Benjamin had found Grace's letter of resignation. Read it once. Read it again. Felt the careful distance in every word, the way she took responsibility for something that wasn't her fault, the way she apologized for existing in a space where Eleanor had decided she didn't belong. He'd failed her. Failed to protect her from Eleanor's malice. failed to see what his sister-in-law was planning until it was too late, failed to understand that defense after the fact doesn't heal the wound of public humiliation. Now he stood in the rain among flowers that would probably survive the storm because they were tougher than they looked, and he spoke aloud to a ghost. "Catherine," his voice was rough, barely audible over the rain. "I don't know if you can hear me, don't know if it matters if you can, but I need to say this. I'm sorry I couldn't make you happy. Sorry I wasn't Daniel, whoever he was. Sorry you felt trapped in a life you didn't choose with a man you didn't love." Thunder rolled across the valley, and Benjamin lifted his face to the rain, letting it mix with tears he hadn't cried in 3 years. "But I can't keep apologizing for being alive. Can't keep living like I'm already buried beside you, waiting for death to make it official. Grace came here, and she saw me. Not the version everyone expected. Not the grief-stricken widower or the stoic rancher or any role I was supposed to play. She saw me, and I saw her. And that was real Catherine. Maybe the first real thing I've felt since you died." The rain came harder, turning the garden paths to mud, but Benjamin didn't move. "I'm letting you go. Not forgetting, not erasing what we had good and bad, just letting go of the guilt. The feeling that I owe you something I can never pay. You made your choices, I made mine. Neither of us was perfect, but we did our best with what we knew." He knelt, placed his hand on the wet earth, feeling the roots beneath. The foundation Grace had helped him understand could support new growth even after years of death. "If there's any way you can forgive me for moving on, I'd appreciate it. But if you can't, I understand. I'm moving on anyway. Because Clara and Henry need a father who's fully present. And because there's a woman walking away from me right now who deserves better than watching me pine for someone who was never truly mine." Owen found him there an hour later, soaked through, still kneeling in the mud. "Sir?" Owen's voice held concern. "You'll catch pneumonia out here." Benjamin looked up, rain streaming down his face. "I lost her, Owen." "Then go get her back. She won't want to see me, not after last night." Owen's expression turned stern in a way he rarely allowed himself with his employer. "Now you listen to me, Benjamin Hartley. I've known you 8 years. Watched you survive loss that would break most men. Watched you build something out of nothing through sheer stubbornness and work ethic. But this is the first time I've seen you give up before the fight even starts. Eleanor destroyed Grace's reputation. What kind of life can she have here now? The same life she had before. Teacher, respected for her work. People have short memories for scandal when the people involved don't act ashamed. You stood up for her last night. Now follow through. Don't let her walk away thinking you only defended her out of obligation. Show her it meant something. Show her you meant every word." Benjamin stood slowly, joints protesting, clothes heavy with rain. "What if she says no?" "Then at least you tried. But Mr. Hartley, with respect, I saw how she looked at you before last night. That woman was falling in love whether she wanted to or not. Eleanor's trick hurt her pride, not her feelings. Give her a reason to come back. Give her something real to hold on to. Because if you let her go without trying, you'll spend the rest of your life wondering what might have been, and that's a worse hell than any I can imagine." Benjamin met Owen's eyes and saw there not just loyalty, but friendship, the kind earned through years of shared work and mutual respect. "Saddle my horse," Benjamin said. "I'm going to Pine Creek." But first he had one more conversation to endure. He found Eleanor in the guest room, packing with the efficient movements of someone who'd been expecting this. She didn't look up when he entered, just kept folding clothes with precise care. "I assume you want me to leave," she said, voice tight. "I asked you to leave last night. You're still here. I needed time to think." "About what?" "How to justify cruelty as concern." Eleanor's hands stilled. She sat on the bed, suddenly looking older than her 38 years. Tired, defeated. "Do you want to know why I did it?" She looked at him finally, and her eyes held a kind of desperate honesty. "Really? Why?" Benjamin waited. "Because I loved you first." The words came out flat like stones dropping into still water. Before Catherine. Before anyone. That night at the church social in 1872, do you remember I told you I had feelings for you? And you looked at me like I'd just confessed to something embarrassing, like I was your little sister making an inappropriate joke. You said I was like family, that you couldn't think of me that way. Benjamin's memory stirred. He'd forgotten that conversation or buried it. A moment so awkward he'd pretended it never happened. 6 months later you met Catherine at that same church, my younger sister, beautiful, charming Catherine, and you fell for her like a stone dropping off a cliff, proposed within 3 months, married her 6 months after that, and I had to stand there and smile and pretend I was happy for you both. Eleanor's voice cracked. Do you have any idea what that was like? Watching you build a life with someone else? Watching you look at her the way I'd dreamed you'd look at me. And then she died, and I thought finally maybe you'd see me. Maybe after an appropriate time you'd realize I'd been there all along, that I'd loved you longer and better than she ever did. Eleanor. Benjamin's voice held a mixture of shock and pity. But you just got more distant, more closed off. And I accepted it. Accepted that I'd love you forever from the sidelines, until she came along. Eleanor's face hardened. Grace. Young, pretty, full of naive hope. And I saw how you looked at her. That same expression you had with Catherine. Like she was water, and you'd been dying of thirst. And I couldn't do it again. Couldn't watch you fall for someone who wasn't me. So I decided to stop it before it started. The room fell silent, except for rain drumming on the roof. I'm sorry, Benjamin said quietly. I never meant to hurt you. I know. That's what makes it worse. You didn't do anything wrong except fail to love me. And how can I blame you for that? Love isn't something we choose. It's something that happens to us whether we want it or not. Eleanor resumed packing. I'll leave today. Go back to Denver. You won't see me again unless you want to. And Benjamin. She looked at him with eyes that held genuine remorse. I know you won't believe this, but I hope you find happiness with her. I hope she loves you the way you deserve. Because despite everything, you are a good man. The best man I know. And that's why I can't stand to be around you anymore. Because loving someone who can't love you back is its own kind of hell. She pulled out paper and pen, wrote quickly, then handed the result to Benjamin. Give this to Grace. It's an apology. Won't fix what I did, but maybe it'll help her understand I'm not entirely evil. Just broken in ways I can't seem to repair. Benjamin took the letter, read it briefly. It was honest, raw, owning the cruelty, without making excuses. It wouldn't erase the damage, but it might ease the weight Grace carried. Thank you, he said. Eleanor nodded once, then returned to her packing, dismissing him without words. Benjamin left her there, went to his room, changed into dry clothes, and prepared for the hardest ride he'd ever make. Not hard because of distance or terrain, but because everything depended on what happened at the end of it. He was riding toward Grace Mitchell with nothing to offer but honesty and hope. No guarantees, no promises that life wouldn't be hard, just the truth of a man who'd been alone too long and had finally remembered what it felt like to want to share his life with someone who saw him clearly and chose him anyway. If she'd have him. If he wasn't too late. If love was enough to overcome pride and hurt and the practical reality that life at Hartley Ridge would never be easy. Owen brought his horse around, already saddled, provisions packed in case this took longer than a day. Owen, Benjamin said, mounting up, if I don't come back with her, don't send anyone after me. I'll either convince her or I'll spend however long it takes camping outside Pine Creek waiting for her to change her mind. Owen grinned, sudden and bright. That's the Benjamin Hartley I know, stubborn as mountain stone. Learned from the best. Benjamin rode north, following the trail Grace had walked the night before, following his last chance at happiness, following hope toward Pine Creek and whatever waited there. Grace Mitchell found Pine Creek exactly as desperate as she felt. The orphanage was a converted logging camp, rough timber buildings that leaked in rain and harbored drafts in winter. Mrs. Abigail Dawson ran it with competent exhaustion, caring for 23 children with resources meant for 10. She took one look at Grace's tear-stained face and packed travel bag and asked no questions. Just offered employment at $15 monthly with room and board. It was less than Hartley Ridge had paid. The room was smaller, colder, shared with 2 other teachers. The children were harder scarred by losses that made Clara and Henry's grief look gentle by comparison. But Grace threw herself into the work with the desperation of someone trying to outrun her own thoughts. She taught reading and arithmetic, helped in the kitchen, mended clothes by lamplight, collapsed into bed exhausted every night, too tired to dream, too broken to hope. Mrs. Dawson observed her for 3 days before speaking. They were in the garden behind the main building, such as it was, mostly dirt and struggling vegetables, nothing like the flower garden Grace had created at Hartley Ridge. "You're running from something, Mrs. Dawson said, pruning shears in hand, working on tomato plants with the same competent efficiency she brought to everything. "I'm working," Grace replied. "Working yourself to death isn't the same as living." "What happened, child?" Grace's careful composure cracked. She told it all. The letter, the public reading, Benjamin's defense that came too late to prevent the damage. Her flight in the darkness. The certainty that she could never go back, never face those people again, never look at Benjamin, without remembering how his sister-in-law had made her feel small and shameful for the crime of having honest feelings. Mrs. Dawson listened without interruption, then set down her shears and took Grace's hands in her own weathered ones. "Let me tell you something I learned when my husband died and left me with 3 children and no money. Pride is expensive. Sometimes we can't afford it. You ran because you were humiliated. That's understandable. But you ran from a place where people cared about you, from children who loved you, from a man who stood up and defended you in front of everyone, risking his own reputation to protect yours. You ran from the hard thing instead of facing it, and honey, running doesn't solve problems. It just moves them to a new location." Grace pulled her hands away. "You weren't there. You didn't hear how they talked about me, how they looked at me." "No, I wasn't. But I've been looked at plenty of ways in my life. Been judged for being poor, for being widowed, for running an orphanage instead of remarrying like a proper woman should. And I learned that what matters isn't how people look at you. It's whether you can look at yourself and feel good about who you are. Can you?" Grace thought about Catherine's garden, about Clara and Henry's laughter, about the way Benjamin had stood in rain beside her digging channels to save flowers everyone else had forgotten. "I don't know," she whispered. "Then that's what you need to figure out. Not here running away, but there facing what scared you. Because the only way to know if something's worth fighting for is to stand your ground and find out." Grace wanted to argue, wanted to explain why going back was impossible, but exhaustion won. She simply nodded and returned to work. Mrs. Dawson's words circling in her mind like birds looking for a place to land. That afternoon, as Grace taught spelling to a group of younger children, commotion erupted outside. Horses, voices, the excitement that comes when routine is disrupted. Grace went to the window, and her heart stopped. Benjamin's wagon pulled by his reliable gray mare, and in the wagon bed, barely visible, 2 small heads. Clara and Henry had come. Grace was moving before conscious thought, running outside, and then Clara was in her arms, crying, laughing, holding on with the desperation of a child who'd lost too many important people to trust that anyone would stay. "Miss Grace, we came to bring you home." "We missed you so much," Henry added, wrapping his arms around both of them. Grace held them close, breathing in the familiar smell of mountain air and wood smoke that clung to their clothes. She looked up to find Benjamin still in the wagon, watching them with an expression that made her chest tight. He climbed down slowly, as if giving her time to refuse him, time to send him away. Approached with the careful movements of a man approaching something fragile that might bolt if startled. "Grace." Her name in his mouth, rough as sandpaper, tender as prayer. "You shouldn't have come," she said, but without conviction. "I had to. Couldn't let you leave thinking I only defended you out of obligation. Couldn't let you believe that what Eleanor did erased what I said." He held out a folded paper. "This is from Eleanor. An apology. Won't undo the damage, but she wanted you to understand why she did it. Wanted to own her cruelty instead of hiding from it. Grace took the letter with trembling hands, opened it, read words she never expected to see. Eleanor's confession of love for Benjamin. Her jealousy. Her broken explanation that didn't excuse the behavior, but at least explained it. And at the end, 3 sentences that struck deeper than anything else. I'm sorry for what I did to you. Benjamin is a better man than I deserve, but not better than you deserve. If you love him, don't let my bitterness poison what could be. Grace. Benjamin's voice pulled her attention back. I've made mistakes. Took too long to see what was right in front of me. Too long to understand that defending you after you were hurt isn't the same as protecting you from being hurt in the first place. But I'm asking if there's any part of you that still feels what you wrote in that letter, give me a chance to prove I can be what you need. Grace looked at him, really looked, saw exhaustion in the lines around his eyes, saw fear beneath the careful control, saw a man who'd ridden 15 miles with his children stowed away in his wagon because he couldn't bear to lose someone else he cared about. What exactly are you offering? She asked quietly. Benjamin glanced at Clara and Henry, then back to Grace. Everything I've got. Partnership. Partnership running the ranch. Partnership raising these 2. Partnership facing whatever comes good or bad. And if you'll have it, if you can stand the idea of marrying a stubborn rancher with more problems than solutions, I'm offering that too. Grace's breath caught. Benjamin, I'm 21 years old. I'm nobody. No family, no money, no position. After last night, my reputation is questionable at best. What kind of wife would that make you? Benjamin stepped closer, close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his gray eyes, close enough to feel the heat of him despite the mountain air. The kind who brings dead things back to life. The kind who stands in floods at 3 in the morning to protect flowers. The kind who loves my children like they're her own. The kind who sees me for what I am instead of what everyone expects. That's the kind of wife you'd make Grace, and I'd count myself the luckiest man in Colorado to have you. Clara tugged on Grace's skirt. Please say yes, Miss Grace. We need you. Papa needs you, and I think you need us too. Grace looked at the 3 of them, Benjamin with his weathered hands and honest eyes, Clara with her fierce intelligence and protective love, Henry with his easy laughter and curiosity about everything. A ready-made family, complicated and imperfect, and offering her something she'd never expected to have. A home. Not just a place, but people who wanted her there, who'd chosen her deliberately, who'd come after her when she ran because they believed she was worth the effort. I don't fit in Denver society, she said, testing, giving him one more chance to change his mind. I'll embarrass you at events, say the wrong thing, use the wrong fork. I don't care about Denver society. I care about you, about us, about building something real instead of something that looks good to people who don't matter. Your lawsuit could fail. You could lose everything. Then we'll start over somewhere else, together. People will talk. Benjamin smiled, then sudden and bright, transforming his whole face. Let them talk. They'll find someone else to gossip about soon enough, and meanwhile, we'll be too busy living to notice. Grace felt her own smile building, unfurling like flowers in spring. You're absolutely sure about this. Never been more sure of anything. She looked at Mrs. Dawson, who'd come out to watch the scene unfold. The older woman nodded once, approval and blessing combined. Grace turned back to Benjamin. Then yes, yes to partnership. Yes to helping raise your children. Yes to facing whatever comes. Yes to all of it. Benjamin's expression transformed into something so openly joyful it made Grace's eyes sting with tears. He reached for her, then paused. May I, please? He kissed her, then gentle as falling petals, tender as the first rain of spring. A kiss that tasted like hope and second chances and the particular sweetness of finding home in another person. Clara and Henry cheered. Mrs. Dawson laughed. And Grace Mitchell, who'd come to Colorado with nothing but a leather satchel and her father's faith in education, found herself surrounded by family she'd chosen and who'd chosen her back. The hardest part wasn't over. There were still battles to fight, reputations to rebuild, futures to secure. But for this moment, standing in the weak sunshine of a Colorado spring afternoon, Grace let herself believe that sometimes the most fragile things survived to become the strongest. Sometimes dead gardens bloomed again. Sometimes broken people found healing. Sometimes love won against odds that should have destroyed it. The journey back to Hartley Ridge took 3 hours. Benjamin drove the wagon while Grace sat beside him, Clara and Henry in the back, all of them talking at once about everything that had happened in the 3 days she'd been gone. Owen had organized the ranch, the calving was going well, the flowers in the garden were surviving despite the storm. Everything was waiting for her return. As they crested the final rise and Hartley Ridge spread before them, Grace felt something settle in her chest. Peace, rightness, the sense of coming home not just to a place, but to a life that fit her like she'd been built for it. That evening, after the children were fed and settled, Benjamin took Grace's hand and led her to his study. There, spread across his desk, were the documents from the lawsuit. "I need to show you something," he said. "Need you to understand what you're agreeing to take on." He explained the legal situation in detail. The forged patent, Brennan's manufactured witnesses, the cost of fighting both in money and time, the very real possibility that despite everything they might lose. Grace listened carefully, then asked the kind of practical questions that told Benjamin she understood business better than most men twice her age. "What happens if you lose?" "We'd have to leave, find new land, start over." "With what money?" "Whatever's left after legal fees. Maybe $500 if we're lucky." Grace nodded slowly. $500 is enough to claim homestead land somewhere else. Not here, probably. But Kansas, maybe. Or Nebraska. Flat country, easier farming. We could build again. Benjamin stared at her. "You're actually thinking about this practically." "Of course. I grew up poor, Benjamin. I know how to make $500 work. It's not what we want. But it's survivable. And surviving is sometimes all you can ask for." He pulled her close, this woman who faced potential disaster with clear eyes and practical planning. "How did I get so lucky?" "You hired a teacher who knew how to grow flowers in dead ground. Everything else followed." 2 weeks later, the courthouse summons arrived. The trial was set for 6 weeks from the date. Benjamin and Grace rode to Denver together, leaving Clara and Henry in Owen's care, presenting themselves to attorney Jonathan Reed as partners in this fight. Reed studied Grace with careful assessment. "Miss Mitchell, I assume you understand that your presence at this trial will invite scrutiny. Mrs. Eleanor Hartley has made certain claims about your relationship with Mr. Hartley that opposing counsel may try to exploit." Grace met his eyes steadily. "Let them try. I have nothing to hide. Mr. Hartley and I plan to marry as soon as the legal situation is resolved. If being honest about that costs us in court, then the law values deception over truth. But I won't pretend to be something I'm not for the convenience of strangers." Reed's expression shifted to respect. "Good. Because I think your testimony about the condition of the land when you arrived about the evidence of continuous occupation and improvement could be valuable, if you're willing to take the stand." "I am." The trial itself was tedious in the way of legal proceedings. Days of testimony about land patents and filing dates and the technical requirements of homestead claims. Brennan's lawyers presented their forged documents with confidence, calling witnesses who swore they'd known Thomas Whitmore, that he'd lived on that land in 1869. But Reed was thorough. He produced evidence of those same witnesses receiving payments from Brennan. He demonstrated inconsistencies in the Whitmore patent details that didn't match land office procedures from 1869. He brought in Owen Fletcher, whose testimony about Benjamin's 8 years of continuous improvement and occupation was delivered with the unshakable authority of a man who'd witnessed every moment of it. And he called Grace. She took the stand wearing her best dress, simple but clean, her hair arranged with care. She spoke clearly about arriving at Hartley Ridge, about the condition of the buildings and land, about the evidence everywhere of years of careful maintenance and improvement, about the garden that had been dead 3 years, proving Catherine Hartley had lived there that long ago, about the children who'd grown up knowing no other home. Brennan's attorney tried to discredit her. "Miss Mitchell, isn't it true that you have personal reasons for wanting Mr. Hartley to retain this property, that you're romantically involved with him?" "Yes," Grace said simply. "We plan to marry." "And doesn't that make your testimony biased?" "My testimony is factual regardless of my feelings. The buildings exist, the improvements exist, the evidence of continuous occupation exists. My potential marriage doesn't change any of that." "But surely you can see how your emotional involvement might color your perception." Grace leaned forward slightly. "Sir, I came to Hartley Ridge as an employee. I observed what was there with objective eyes because I had no stake in the outcome. What I saw was 8 years of hard work. A man who'd built something from nothing. Children being raised in the only home they'd ever known. That's not colored perception. That's truth. My feelings for Mr. Hartley developed after I saw his character demonstrated through his work. If anything, my emotional involvement makes me more certain of his integrity, not less." The attorney had no response to that. Grace stepped down and Benjamin caught her hand as she passed, squeezing gently. The judge deliberated for 2 days. When he returned with his verdict, the courtroom fell silent. "Having reviewed all evidence and testimony, I find that the patent filed by Thomas Whitmore in 1869 shows clear signs of forgery. The paper stock doesn't match documents from that period. The seal is inconsistent with land office practices of the time. And the testimony of witnesses claiming to have known Mr. Whitmore is contradicted by their own financial records showing payments from the plaintiff." He looked directly at Brennan. "Sir, you have attempted to defraud a legitimate homesteader through manufactured documentation. I'm ruling in favor of Mr. Benjamin Hartley. The land claim is valid and will remain in his possession. Furthermore, you are ordered to pay Mr. Hartley's legal fees in the amount of $650 plus damages of $200 for the time and hardship this fraudulent suit has caused." The gavel struck, and it was over. Benjamin stood slowly as if not quite believing it. Owen let out a whoop from the gallery. Grace felt tears streaming down her face, relief and joy mixing into something too big for words. They'd won. Against odds and money and legal manipulation, they'd won. Hartley Ridge was secure. The future was possible. Everything they'd fought for was safe. Outside the courthouse, Colonel Bradford approached them, his expression carrying respect Grace hadn't seen the night of the gala. "Mr. Hartley, Miss Mitchell, I owe you both an apology. I allowed myself to be influenced by social considerations that had no bearing on your character. I should have trusted my initial impression of you both. If the offer of business partnership still stands, I'd be honored to invest in Hartley Ridge." Benjamin looked at Grace, a question in his eyes. She nodded slightly. "The offer stands," Benjamin said, "but on one condition. You treat my future wife with the respect she's earned, not as hired help, not as someone beneath notice, but as my full partner in all things." Bradford smiled. "I wouldn't dream of doing otherwise. Mrs. Mitchell, when the time comes, I hope you'll accept my congratulations on your marriage." The wedding was set for 2 weeks after the trial concluded. Simple ceremony, as befitted mountain people who valued substance over show. The white gazebo in the garden surrounded by flowers Grace and the children had nurtured back to life. Pastor Miller from Pine Creek officiating, Owen as best man. Mrs. Dawson standing with Grace in lieu of family she didn't have. Clara and Henry had decorated the gazebo with wildflowers woven through the lattice. Purple lupines and blue forget-me-nots and yellow columbines creating a natural cathedral more beautiful than anything money could buy. Grace wore a dress of simple white muslin, her hair adorned with flowers Clara had carefully placed that morning. She stood under the gazebo with Benjamin beside her, Owen and Mrs. Dawson flanking them, Clara and Henry watching with barely contained excitement. Pastor Miller smiled at them both. "We're gathered here not because of obligation or convenience, but because 2 people found each other in circumstances that could have remained simply professional and chose instead to build something more. Benjamin, do you take Grace to be your lawfully wedded wife?" Benjamin looked at Grace, and his eyes held everything he'd learned about love through loss and rediscovery. "I do. With everything I have. With everything I am." "Grace, do you take Benjamin to be your lawfully wedded husband?" Grace felt her voice steady, despite the tears on her cheeks. "I do. For all the days ahead, in whatever comes." "Then by the authority vested in me, I pronounce you husband and wife. Benjamin, you may kiss your bride." Benjamin cupped Grace's face with work-roughened hands that were infinitely gentle. "Thank you," he whispered, "for seeing me, for choosing me, for being brave enough to stay." "Thank you," Grace whispered back, "for coming after me, for not letting me run, for offering me a home." They kissed while Clara and Henry cheered, and Owen wiped his eyes without shame, and Mrs. Dawson smiled with the satisfaction of someone who'd been right about everything. After the ceremony, Clara stood and cleared her throat for attention. "Miss Grace, I mean Mrs. Hartley, I mean Mother Grace." She stumbled over the names, blushing. "I wanted to read something." She opened Grace's old journal, the one she'd been given permission to read from. Found the entry from March 3 months ago when Grace first arrived at Hartley Ridge. "Today I watered wildflowers with tears, but also with faith. I don't know if someday they'll bloom, but if they do, perhaps they can return to this place the life it lost." Clara closed the book, her voice strong despite emotion. "They did bloom, and they brought life back, not just to the garden, but to all of us. Thank you, Mother Grace, for believing in dead things, for showing us that sometimes what looks finished is just waiting for the right person to care." There wasn't a dry eye in the small gathering. Grace pulled Clara into a hug, then Henry, then found herself surrounded by her new family, chosen and choosing back, proving that sometimes the best things in life came not from blood or tradition, but from the simple courage to stay and fight for what mattered. Owen raised his glass, such as it was, tin cup filled with cider. "To Benjamin and Grace, may your garden always bloom. May your children always laugh. May your love survive every storm. And may you both remember that the best things in life are built, not given. You've built something fine here, something that'll last. To the Hartleys." "To the Hartleys?" everyone echoed. They celebrated with the simple meal Owen and Mrs. Dawson had prepared. Bread and cheese and fresh vegetables from the garden. Nothing fancy. Nothing that tried to be more than it was. Just good food shared with people who mattered, which was really all any celebration needed. As evening fell and Mrs. Dawson prepared to ride back to Pine Creek, she pulled Grace aside. "You did it, child. Found your place. Built your family. Made something real out of nothing. I couldn't have done it without your advice, without you pushing me to go back." Mrs. Dawson smiled. "You'd have figured it out eventually. Some people are runners and some are fighters. You just needed reminding which one you are. Now go. Your husband's waiting. Your children need tucking in. Your life needs living." Grace hugged the older woman, grateful beyond words, then turned back to the cabin that was now truly home, to the man who was now truly hers, to the children who were now truly family, to the life she'd built from seeds and hope and the stubborn refusal to accept that dead things had to stay dead. 9 years passed. 9 springs where wildflowers bloomed without fail. 9 summers of hard work and harder lessons. 9 autumns of harvest, some abundant and some sparse, but all earned through sweat and determination. 9 winters where the family gathered close and told stories and remembered how far they'd come. The Sullivan Hartley School opened in Denver in 1883, funded by profits from the ranch and Colonel Bradford's investment. Grace split her time between Hartley Ridge and Denver, teaching during the school year, returning to the mountains in summer. Benjamin traveled with her when he could, bringing Clara and Henry, showing them the world beyond the ranch while making sure they never forgot where home was. Clara, 18, now studied medicine at the University of Denver. One of only 7 women in her class facing prejudice daily, but facing it with the same stubborn determination her father had taught her. She planned to return to Colorado and practice among the mountain communities that had no doctors bringing healing to places that needed it most. Henry 15 wrote poetry about mountains and family and the particular beauty of watching things grow. His words appeared in Denver newspapers under a pseudonym, gaining attention from people who didn't know the serious young poet was a rancher's son who could also rope cattle and shoe horses and fix anything that broke. Grace and Benjamin stood in the garden one May afternoon in 1887, watching their younger children play among the flowers. Lily, 6 years old, with her mother's determination and her father's gray eyes. Edward, 3 years old, and named for the grandfather he'd never meet, already showing signs of the curiosity and intelligence that had defined the teacher who'd started it all. 10 years, Benjamin said quietly, his arm around Grace's waist. Feels like yesterday. Feels like forever. Both, Grace agreed. That's how the good things feel, immediate and eternal all at once. Every year on their anniversary, they planted a new variety of wildflower. This year, Grace had chosen Indian paintbrush vibrant red-orange that would complement the blues and purples already established. Lily knelt beside her mother, hands in the dirt, laughing when earthworms wiggled between her fingers. "Mama, will these flowers be here when I'm old?" Grace smiled. "If someone tends them." That's the thing about gardens, sweetheart. They require work, attention, care. But if you give them that, they'll outlive you. They'll be here for your children and their children and on and on. That's legacy. Not what we take with us, but what we leave behind that keeps growing. Benjamin watched his daughter absorb this lesson, watched his son examine a beetle with the same focused interest Grace had once brought to dead ground. Watched his wife, still beautiful to him, still surprising him with her strength and wisdom, still the best decision he'd ever made. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked suddenly. "Staying here? You could have gone anywhere, done anything. You're smart enough to teach at universities. Could have moved to San Francisco or Boston or anywhere with culture and society and everything Colorado doesn't have." Grace looked at him with the direct honesty that had first caught his attention a decade ago. "I could have, but I didn't want any of that. I wanted this, you, them, the work of building something that matters, the particular satisfaction of watching seeds become gardens, and children become capable adults, and love become the foundation everything else stands on." She gestured at the ranch spread around them. "This place was dead when I arrived. Not just the garden, all of it, holding its breath, waiting for permission to live again. We gave it that permission, and it repaid us by becoming exactly what we needed. Home, real home. The kind you choose and build and protect because it's yours in ways that money can't buy and law can't take away. Even after everything Eleanor did, after the scandal and the humiliation, especially after that, because we survived it, came through the other side stronger, proved that gossip can't destroy what's built on truth. That's worth more than an easy life where nothing's ever tested." Benjamin pulled her close, pressed his lips to her hair, breathed in the scent of mountain air, and the particular perfume of the wildflowers she still tended with the same care she'd shown that first season. "I love you, Grace Hartley. More than when we started, more every day. I love you too. All of you. This whole impossible family we built from broken pieces." They stood together while the sun tracked west, painting everything in gold and amber, watching their children play in the garden that had started it all. The garden that had taught them dead things could bloom again if someone cared enough to try. That evening, as the family gathered for dinner, a knock came at the door. Owen answered and returned with an envelope bearing an unfamiliar return address. San Francisco. Benjamin opened it, read briefly, then handed it to Grace without comment. The letter was from Eleanor. "Dear Benjamin and Grace, I hope this letter finds you well. I'm writing from San Francisco, where I've been working at an orphanage for the past 8 years. It's hard work, poorly paid, and the most fulfilling thing I've ever done. Caring for children nobody else wants has taught me more about love than I learned in all the years I spent pining for someone who could never love me back. I'm not writing to ask forgiveness. I know what I did was unforgivable. I destroyed something fragile and beautiful because I couldn't stand to watch someone else have what I wanted. That was small of me. Cruel. Everything I swore I'd never become. But I am writing to tell you that I've found my own garden to tend. These children need me in ways I never knew I needed to be needed. I'm building something here. Not the life I imagined, but a life that matters. And perhaps that's enough. I hope you're happy, both of you. I hope the ranch prospers. I hope Clara and Henry grow into the remarkable adults they're already becoming. You deserve every good thing that comes your way. I won't write again. This isn't an attempt to restore relationship, just a closing of accounts. A final acknowledgement that you were right and I was wrong, and that I'm grateful you found each other despite my best efforts to prevent it. May your wildflowers bloom forever. Eleanor Grace set the letter down carefully. She found her second spring, different from what she wanted, but hers nonetheless. "Should I write back?" Benjamin asked. "I don't know. What do you think?" He considered, then shook his head. "Some doors are better left closed. We've moved forward, so has she. Maybe that's enough." Grace nodded agreement. They would remember Eleanor not with bitterness, but with the complicated understanding that hurt people, and sometimes the best outcome is when everyone finds their own path to healing, even if those paths never cross again. The years continued their steady march. The Sullivan Hartley School grew to serve over 100 children. Clara became Dr. Clara Hartley, the first woman physician in 3 mountain counties. Henry's poetry was published in a collection that sold surprisingly well, proving that people hungry for beauty would find it even in unexpected places. Lily showed signs of her mother's teaching gift working alongside Grace in the Denver school during summers. Edward, as he grew, demonstrated Benjamin's practical genius for building and fixing, combined with Grace's intellectual curiosity about why things worked the way they did. The ranch prospered, not wealthy by Denver standards, but comfortable, secure, built on work and wisdom, and the legacy of a man who'd refused to quit when everything said he should, and a woman who'd seen life where everyone else saw death. In 1915, Henry Hartley sat in his Denver law office, now 42 years old, successful in ways his parents could never have imagined, but that they'd made possible through their insistence on education and opportunity. He'd been thinking about his father all day, memories triggered by news that a local rancher was facing a fraudulent land claim case similar to Benjamin's all those years ago. Henry picked up the phone, that modern miracle his father had lived just long enough to see become common, and called his sister. "Clara, it's Henry. I was just thinking about Father and Grace, about their story, about how we almost lost everything because of Brennan's lies, and how they fought back." Clara's voice came through clear despite the distance. "I think about it often. How close we came to losing Hartley Ridge. How different our lives would have been if Grace hadn't come. If Father hadn't been brave enough to defend her, if they hadn't chosen each other despite everything." "I'm writing it down," Henry said. "The whole story, for our children. So they understand that what they have didn't come easy. That legacy is built through courage and work and the refusal to give up when things get hard. Father would like that. Grace too." After they hung up, Henry pulled out fresh paper and began to write. Not poetry this time, but story. The true story of Benjamin Hartley and Grace Mitchell, of Eleanor's bitter jealousy and Owen's quiet loyalty, of Clara and Henry, who watched adults struggle and learned lessons that shaped who they'd become. He wrote about wildflowers and second chances, about gardens that bloomed after years of death, about love that survived scandal and legal battles, and the particular challenges of building something real in country that didn't forgive weakness. He wrote until his hand cramped, until the words had all been poured out onto paper, until the story was complete from beginning to end. Then he sat back and read it through, seeing his parents young again, seeing himself and Clara as children who didn't yet understand how lucky they were. The story ended not with his parents' death, both of them gone now, his father in 1910 and Grace just last year, but with an image that had never left Henry's memory. A photograph taken in 1887, the whole family in the wildflower garden. Benjamin and Grace at the center, surrounded by children, surrounded by blooms, in impossible colors, surrounded by the evidence of life, returning to what everyone had declared dead. His father's voice echoed in memory. "Legacy isn't what we take with us, son. It's what we leave behind that keeps growing." Henry looked out his office window toward the mountains, where Hartley Ridge still stood, still productive, still home to the next generation. The wildflower garden still bloomed every spring, tended now by Lily's children who'd heard the story and understood that something worth having was worth protecting. The Sullivan Hartley School still operated now, run by educators who'd never met Grace, but who carried forward her conviction that knowledge was a right, not a privilege. Hundreds of children had passed through its doors, carrying into the world the legacy of a woman who'd believed dead things could bloom again if someone cared enough to try. That was legacy. Not monuments or fortunes, though both had their place. But the continuing ripple of choices made of courage demonstrated of love chosen despite difficulty. Of gardens planted and tended until they became self-sustaining, feeding future generations with beauty and hope. Henry picked up the telephone again, this time calling his own son. Young Edward, named for his great-grandfather, the teacher studying agriculture at Colorado State. "Edward, your grandfather and grandmother's story. I've finally written it down, all of it. The truth of how they met, how they fought for each other, how they built what we have now. I want you to read it, to understand where you come from, to know that the easy life you have now was bought with their courage and work." His son's voice young and serious. "I'd like that, Father. I've always wanted to know the full story. They seemed so perfect in the photos. I want to know the real them." "They weren't perfect," Henry said. "They were human, scared sometimes, uncertain often, but they kept choosing courage, kept choosing each other, kept believing that dead things could bloom again if someone had faith enough to water them. That's the story. That's the legacy. That's what I want you to carry forward." After the call ended, Henry walked to his window one final time, looking west toward mountains that held his childhood, his history, his foundation. The sunset painted everything in colors that matched his memory of wildflowers in endless bloom. He thought about his father teaching him to hammer fence posts with exactly 3 strikes. About Grace showing him how grass knows mathematics and everything in nature knows truth if humans will only pay attention. About Owen's quiet loyalty and Eleanor's bitter redemption and all the complicated human stories that had woven together to create the tapestry of his life. And he understood finally what his father had tried to teach him all those years ago during fence repairs in the North Pasture. Legacy wasn't about being perfect. It was about being present, about showing up daily to do the work. Teach the lessons, build the foundations that would outlast your own short span of years. It was about planting seeds you might not live to see bloom, trusting that if you did your part, others would continue the work. About creating something that mattered, not because it made you rich or famous, but because it made the world a little better, a little more beautiful, a little more hopeful than you found it. His parents had done that, had taken broken people and dead ground and impossible odds, and had built something that was still growing, still blooming, still feeding lives decades after their own had ended. That was legacy worth having. That was the story worth telling. And as Henry Hartley returned to his desk to file away the pages he'd written to preserve them for children and grandchildren not yet born, he smiled, because he knew that somewhere in whatever comes after this life, his father and Grace were still together, still tending gardens, still showing each other how to love through action rather than words, still blooming even in whatever soil eternity provided. The mountains stood as they always had, patient witnesses to human drama, holding stories in stone and snow. And at Hartley Ridge in the garden, where Grace had first dared to plant seeds in dead-ground wildflowers, bloomed in colors that seemed impossible against the harsh backdrop of mountain stone. Blue and purple and yellow and red. Beauty surviving through cold and storm, and the simple courage of continuing to grow. Like love, like hope, like legacy. Forever blooming, forever teaching, forever proving that sometimes the most fragile things become the strongest if only they survive until spring.